Thank you so much. It is absolutely fabulous to be here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I in fact am a lifelong cyclist. Early in my life I began cycling out of necessity. Two wheels was the best way for me to get around as a kid and in my teenage years. And in fact, that ingrained in me not only a love for cycling, but a recognition that it's simply a fabulous way to get from point A to point B. It's a great way to move in the city. What I'd like to do tonight is tell you a little bit of a story. And I'm hoping that this story can be a bit of an inspiration. Because of course, we've achieved many great things, as Jared has just outlined, but we have a very long way to go. And from my perspective, our objective is really about creating a multimodal city, creating a city where we have choice to move around in a whole varieties of ways, and that those choices are real choices and they are in fact safe choices. So I'd like to begin with my story, and my story involves, you can put up my first slide there, there's no clicker here. And my story involves going back in time a little bit. And when I submitted these slides for this presentation this evening, I was asked, you want a slide with an old lady on it? Well, let me tell you something about that old lady. That old lady's my grandmother. And that old lady on that bike when this picture was taken was 86 years old. Today she's 93 and very, very healthy and well. And this picture was taken when she was visiting her home and native land, which is in fact Holland. And it was taken when she was traveling to visit friends, moving from one town to the next. This was and is a form of transportation. I know it looks very pretty and very leisurely, but it was a way of moving from place to place. And my grandmother has always kept a bike in Holland ever since she's lived there. Now, when my grandmother turned 85, which was several years ago, she bestowed on our family a wonderful gift, and it is this. She gave us a copy of her life story. 300-page book. She wrote her story from beginning to end. It's a wonderful story, particularly if you're related to her in some way, because it's a family story. But recently I was rereading this story, and I noticed something quite shocking, and it is this. The story, as she tells it, shifts at one point from being a story of being raised in Holland, in Haarlem, just outside of Amsterdam. And the story is about growing up as a young girl, and then the war comes, and there's a story of the Nazis invading and occupying Holland. And then the story shifts as she immigrates to Canada and begins her new life with her young husband, my grandfather, here in Canada. But in reading the story for the second time, the first time I was just trying to soak up every detail. In reading the story the second time, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed the first time. When my grandmother told stories in the context of her life in Holland, she measured distance in bicycle rides. Everything she did came down to a bicycle ride. We got on a bicycle ride. It was a 10-minute ride to get to school. It was a 5-minute ride to the corner market. It was a 20-minute ride to church on Sunday morning. It was a 2-hour ride to visit my aunt and uncle in a neighboring town. We got on the bikes and cycled. Everything was measured in a bike ride. What happened, of course, when she came to Canada was that the story shifted, and I'm positive this was not intentional, it was reality. She began to measure everything in terms of a drive. So the language shifts as her journey from living in Holland to living in Canada shifts. Her story shifts to be a story that is measured in drives, how she drove from one place to the next. What's so fascinating to me about this story is that my grandmother never made a choice. She didn't say, in Holland, I'm a cyclist. In Canada, I drive. That's how I get around in Canada. No, that's not the way it happened at all. Rather, the infrastructure changed. All the clues in the urban environment are different in Holland than they are in the Canadian context. And as a result, she made fundamentally choices that were part of the culture around her because the infrastructure was different. And we know this to be true. We've seen this in the City of Toronto, that when we build different infrastructure, people make different kind of choices about how they move about in the city. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about this story, because a very interesting thing happened after my grandmother left Holland. There was the war. She was there for the war. She left in the 50s, just after the war. In 1957 in Holland, the primary way of moving from place to place was on a bike. And the average distance people traveled was 3.9 kilometers. But then something happened. As Europe was rebuilding, became very wealthy. And as it became wealthy, roads were widened, buildings were torn down, and people began driving from place to place. By 1975, the average journey, the average commute, had extended to be 23 kilometers, a fundamental shift. People were cycling. My grandmother grew up in that era of cycling. She left the country, and actually the infrastructure began to change as people became wealthier and as car ownership became more possible. Well, along with this shift in infrastructure came something else. There came tragedy. Children, and this is a protest, a sign from a protest that was widely recognized as being the beginning of the cycling movement in Holland in the late 70s, children were in fact getting hit by cars and were dying in the street. Now, in some ways this is a terrible story, but in some ways it's a wonderful story because we all know how it ends. Anyone who knows anything about cycling in Amsterdam today knows that this was the beginning of the modern movement of creating a cycling city. And I like this story because it shows how our infrastructure dictates or translates into the way that we move in any given environment. But it's also a story of change. It's a story of choice. And I believe we ought to be empowered by this story because we know that we need to change how we move in our city, to provide more choice, to ensure that our city is a safe place for everyone, whether you're walking or whether you're cycling or whether you're moving in other ways using transit or driving. So there's a great opportunity before us in the context of becoming a bicycle-friendly city to create a city that is in fact more sustainable, more livable, and more safe. And we know that other places have been there, gone through a transition, and come back again. We have the opportunity before us to become something quite different from what it is that we are today. Now, if we look at where we're going, many of you have probably seen this chart from the recent Pembina report on congestion in Canadian cities. And, you can poke a little bit at this data. For example, we know that Vancouver is really more translatable right to the downtown of Toronto than the amalgamated city. But still, the point can be made and should be made that we know that we're laggards when it comes to building cycling infrastructure. The data is very clear on the role that cycling can play in creating great communities. We know that. We also know how to build it. That's not the problem either. It's not a design problem. So we have an opportunity before us to become something fundamentally different from what we are today. So what does the future look like? Well, Jared mentioned in his opening comments the recently approved by City Council plan for Eglinton Avenue, straight across the heart of the city, straight across the center of the city. Cycling lanes that link together a whole variety of components of the old cities that make the new City of Toronto. There's a very powerful metaphor in this infrastructure running right through the heart of the city that was approved as part of the Eglinton Crosstown project. Now, it wasn't easy to get to this point, to get this planning framework and this environmental assessment approved at City Council. It has taken a tremendous number of consultations, over 70 consultations over 2 years in order to create this planning framework. And it will take many more to get it implemented. But we ought to hold this out in front of us as a vision of what we could be as a city. Because we could be a city where young children can travel to school in cycling lanes and be safe. We could be a city where someone like my 86-year-old grandmother isn't afraid to get out and cycle. She knows how to cycle, but she wouldn't do it here. We could be a city where cycling is a critical part of our transportation infrastructure. That is the great opportunity that is in front of us today. And what might that look like? This is in fact a proposed cycling policy framework that we are going to be bringing forward to City Council in the context of our official plan review, looking at how we move in the city. And there's a big idea here in the context of this cycling framework. And of course, you recognize the grid. And the grid is a very important overlay. The assumption being that if we treat cycling like we treat other infrastructure, and in particular transportation infrastructure, we know the infrastructure must be continuous. The cycling lanes must be continuous. And we know that we have a great opportunity, if we look at many of our major arterials, to integrate that cycling infrastructure in a safe and separated way along our main arterials. So this is a very important policy framework. We, in fact, in the context of Eglinton Connects, we had many, many conversations around whether there should be or there shouldn't be and how they might be designed, those cycling lanes. If, in fact, we embrace this policy framework in the context of our official plan, then we don't have to have that conversation over and over again as to whether cycling infrastructure really belongs in this city. We can begin with the design exercise of figuring out how to do it. So this is a great opportunity for our city to push the conversation one step further to advance a bicycle-friendly city. And I'll leave you on this final note. Some of you might recognize this heat map from the app that was created in order to track where cyclists are going. In fact, many of your routes around the room are on this app, the red lines that you see here. And there's a couple of great observations that we see from this image. And the first one is this, that the busiest streets for cars are also the busiest streets for bikes. And one of the reasons is quite simple, that cyclists want to go the places that people want to go. It's so simple. So creating the infrastructure to ensure we can move in a very straightforward, a linear way between 2 points, using cycling as a critical part of our transportation infrastructure, ought to be our vision and our hope for this city. This is really about being hopeful about the future. This is about recognizing that a cycling city is in fact a more humane city. A cycling city is a livable city for people of all ages, from 8 to 80. A cycling city is also a sustainable city where we tread more lightly on our resources. A cycling city is also a lively city. It's a place where we have the opportunity to interact and connect with each other in new ways. And lastly, a cycling city, we know, is also a thriving city.